Almighty Zeus, riding the tireless-footed thunder, your seasons, as they weave their dance to the lyre's mosaic of song, have sent me to witness the greatest of the games.
So sang Pindar, greatest of the Greek lyric poets, to celebrate the winner of the chariot race in the Olympic Games of 452 BC. This is the centre of what remains of ancient Olympia. It was a small settlement, not even a village, in a remote corner of western Greece. Politically insignificant, Olympia was vitally important as a religious centre, for here was the principal sanctuary of Zeus. And here, for more than 1,000 years, the Olympic Games were held. Every 4 years, this rustic spot came to life as thousands of athletes, officials and spectators gathered from all over the Greek world to celebrate the great games. Originally, perhaps, these were the funeral games for the hero Pelops, after whom the Peloponnese is named, or possibly his wedding rites. But from 776 BC, they were the festival of Zeus. It's impossible not to think of the modern Olympic Games in this context, but the difference is enormous. The modern games are secular, the ancient ones were religious. Twice the modern games have been abandoned because of war. The ancient Greeks provided safe passage for competitors and spectators during their interstate wars. Even in 480, with the Persians at the gates, the games went on, and the Persians marveled at those who competed not for material reward but for honor. There were hundreds of other Greek games of lesser local interest, but 4 ranked above all: Olympia, Delphi, Isthmia, and Nemea. Together they were known as the circuit, and the only prize at each was a simple wreath. Of all the games, those at Olympia were the most important. Olympia lies in the beautiful pastoral valley of the river Alpheus, and in contrast with many parts of Greece is green, even lush, shaded by pines and oaks as well as olive trees. Beside the river was a sacred grove called the Altis, and within the grove the sanctuary of Zeus. To the north of the site is Mount Kronion. On the other 3 sides the precinct is enclosed by low walls, the remains dating mainly from the Roman period. Various buildings, including a palaestra or wrestling school, lie outside the Altis enclosure. The buildings and altars within were sacred to the gods, above all to Zeus. Today the temple of Zeus, indeed the whole Altis, lies in ruins, the result of earthquake and deliberate destruction. The model gives an idea of the sanctuary at the height of its fame. It's dominated by the massive temple of Zeus. To the north is the temple of Hera, and between the funeral mound of the hero Pelops, another reason for the sanctity of the site. The temple of Hera, the oldest of the buildings at Olympia, was built in the 7th century. A goddess was worshipped here long before the god took over. At the western end of the temple was an archaic group of Zeus and Hera. The colossal head of Hera, which dates from the beginning of the 6th century, is now in the Olympia Museum. As well as the mound of Pelops, there were other ancient altars nearby, to Hera, the mother of the gods, and to Zeus. Remember that a temple wasn't a place for congregational worship, it was the home of the god. The impressive tumbled columns are all that remain of the Temple of Zeus. It was built in the mid-5th century, and besides being the most important in the Altis, was one of the largest temples of mainland Greece. It housed one of the most famous statues in the ancient world, the gold and ivory statue of Zeus by the Athenian sculptor Phidias. There was even a gallery for sightseers to walk round and inspect it. The statue, which was 40 feet high, was made in Phidias' workshop, which still stands behind the temple just outside the Altis. Tools and a cup inscribed with the name of Phidias have been excavated within the building. Later, it was converted into a Byzantine church. The temple was marvelously decorated. One pediment showed Zeus himself presiding over the preparations for the chariot race in which Pelops won his bride. The other showed a scene that was famous in legend, in which drunken centaurs broke up the marriage feast of the hero Pirithous. Fighting goes on all round as the centaurs try to carry off the women, while above all stands Apollo, remote and aloof. On the hillside above the temple of Hera is a row of treasuries, small square buildings dating from the 6th century. Great religious centers like Olympia received rich offerings, and each state proudly kept its offerings separate in its treasury. They served also as banks, where communities and individuals might deposit their money. This is the treasury of Sicyon, something of an exception since most of the other treasuries belong to cities outside mainland Greece. Some of the votive offerings housed in the treasuries are now in the Olympia Museum. Many were offerings made by Greek cities, a tenth of the booty won in battle. This helmet is inscribed, Miltiades dedicated this to Zeus. Miltiades was the Athenian general at the Battle of Marathon in 490. Other items were donated by private individuals. Some of the events of the games, boxing and wrestling for instance, were held right here among the trees and buildings. But of course it wasn't possible to run or hold chariot races in this clutter. For that the competitors had to go elsewhere. From the Altis, a tunnel led into the stadium. This isn't the first stadium. The earlier racetrack had begun near the tomb of Pelops and the altar of Zeus. Later, as the games developed, the foot races were shifted to where the chariot racing took place down by the river. Of the hippodrome, nothing remains today. The river has taken it all. The stadium, as we see it today, is nearly 200 meters long. There's a stone curb round the edge with drinking basins. At the far end are the starting sills with the marks for the runner's toes. At the other end is the finishing line. And on the far side, an enclosure which must have been the judge's box. And all round, dirt embankments which would accommodate about 40,000 spectators squeezed together. There were no women. Neither women nor slaves were allowed to take part in the games, nor could they watch them. Second only to the festival of Olympian Zeus was the festival of Pythian Apollo. This too was held every 4 years, 2 years after the Olympic Games, at Delphi, high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. This too is a site of great holiness and antiquity, but an awesome place, by contrast with the pastoral setting of Olympia. Above the temple of Apollo is the 1,000-foot precipice of the Phydriades, the shining cliffs. This was for the Greeks the center of the world. They told how Zeus released 2 eagles from the ends of the earth, and they met here. The Greeks called Delphi the navel of the world, the omphalos. In a cleft between the Phydriades rises the sacred spring, the Castalia. Here the pilgrim would purify himself before entering the sanctuary, washing his hair, or if he'd taken life, his whole body. From here, the ways diverge. In the distance is the so-called marmaria, the marbles. It was the sanctuary of Athene, and contains at least one treasury and temple, as well as the circular building, the tholos. This is one of the best-known ancient buildings surviving in Greece, but we don't in fact know what its purpose was. Nearby is the gymnasium, Roman in its present form. On the upper level is a practice ground, and below the palaestra. There's also a large cold bath. Below is the Gulf of Itea. Somewhere down there the chariot racing must have taken place. There's nowhere flat enough up here in the hills. In antiquity, many pilgrims came to Delphi via the port of Kyrra, near the present Itea, rather than over the mountains. In the other direction from the marmaria is the main site, the sanctuary of Apollo. The sacred way runs up from the main gate. On either side stood statues and other public offerings. Only the bases remain. Then come the treasuries, like those of Olympia. The richest of these belonged to the island of Sifnos, which had valuable gold mines. It was intended to outdo in opulence all the other treasuries at Delphi. Its powerful archaic sculpture is now in the museum. One of the pediments shows the struggle between Apollo and Heracles over the Delphic tripod. The frieze shows the battle of gods and giants. Nearby, the treasury of the Athenians has been reconstructed so that we can see what these miniature temples were like. The sculptures of the frieze represent the exploits of Theseus, the great Athenian hero, and Heracles. The walls are covered with inscriptions, and it's the fact that they run all over the blocks of stone that has enabled the archaeologists to reconstruct the building accurately. On the wall was also found inscribed one of the earliest scores of ancient music, a hymn to Apollo. The letters above the lines represent notes. The sacred way curves round past the treasury of the Athenians. On the left is the so-called Rock of the Sibyl, perhaps an oracular seat of the Earth Mother before Apollo took over. Opposite is the threshing floor, as it was called, a circular area originally kept clear and used to perform the sacred drama of Apollo killing the snake monster Python. It was performed every 7 years. Above is the supporting wall of the temple, every stone irregular in shape, but carefully fitted together like pieces of a jigsaw. Over the years, it was covered with writing, mostly recording the manumission of slaves or honors for visitors. The sacred way is lined with the remains of monuments, including the base of the tripod of Plataea, the most famous offering in Delphi, dedicated by the Greeks to commemorate their defeat of the Persians in 479. The Temple of Apollo dominates the sanctuary. It's the latest of several temples said to have been dedicated on this site. It was here on 9 days of the year, 9 days only, that the Pythian priestess gave the gods oracular response to inquiring worshippers. She was seated on the tripod over a chasm in the inner shrine. But earthquake and deliberate destruction have made it impossible to work out details of the interior. Above the temple is the theatre. Dionysus was worshipped at Delphi too. Before his theatre was built, there may have been musical contests. High above the theatre is the stadium, more than 2,000 feet above sea level. It's 582 feet long and holds 7,000 spectators. As we see it today, it's Roman. The tiers of seats and monumental arches were built in the 2nd century AD. But the form of the stadium goes back to the classical period of Greece. The starting line is clearly visible and has holes for wooden posts to separate the 17 or 18 runners, and the finishing line is similarly divided. This suggests there were lanes for the runners. The prestige and influence of Delphi extended far beyond the Greek world, and it's worth bearing in mind that the games were often an occasion for political activity as well as a religious and athletic festival. The other Panhellenic sites, Isthmia and Nemea, were much less important. They slipped into the odd-numbered years between the two great festivals. Now let's look at the games in detail. As well as the literary references, we can draw on the evidence of sculpture, of athletes, and of victors. Coins issued by various cities to celebrate victories. And above all, vase paintings, evocative but not necessarily accurate. Apart from the paintings themselves, don't miss the vase shapes. In the spring of an Olympic year, 3 sacred heralds set out from Olympia to visit every corner of the Greek world, proclaiming the forthcoming games and the sacred truce which enabled athletes, judges and spectators to travel to Olympia in safety. During the truce, wars between Greek cities temporarily ceased, death penalties were suspended, and persons carrying arms were banned from the district around Olympia. At least a month before the games, the competitors were required to present themselves at Olympia and to train there under the eyes of the judges. They had to be pure Greek and free from blood guilt. At the end of the summer, at the time of the 2nd or 3rd full moon after the summer solstice, the games began. The first day was given over to the ceremonial inauguration. Before Zeus, god of oaths, the competitors swore that they had trained properly and wouldn't cheat. Slaves, foreigners, or cities that had failed to observe the truce were excluded. This was a solemn ceremony. The rest of the day was given over to minor events, some of the boys' competitions, for instance. Then came the main contests. The second day began with a bang, the horse races and the 4-horse chariot event. We know of 40 competitors for this one year at Delphi. The event was dominated by rich aristocratic owners, often from overseas, who commemorated their victories on issues of coins. In the afternoon came the pentathlon, the 5-event contest. First, the discus, made of bronze and thrown with a technique similar to the modern one. Next came the long jump. We know they used jumping weights, and there's a pair in the Olympia Museum dedicated by a grateful victor. But we don't know the precise technique used. An ancient Greek claimed to have cleared 52 feet. If so, it must have been a multiple jump. After the long jump came the javelin. The remaining events were the foot race and wrestling, of which more in a minute. The second day closed with rites in honor of the hero Pelops. The third day, which coincided with the full moon, began with a great sacrifice, the religious climax of the festival. Everyone went in procession to the altar of Zeus. Here 100 oxen were killed and their thighs burned on the mound of ashes that had accumulated over the years. The rest of the meat was eaten at the banquet that evening. In the afternoon came the foot races. The long distance was 24 lengths of the stadium. The sprint was a single length, about 200 meters. The third race was double length. There was a standing start marked by a trumpet blast. In later years, starting gates were used. We don't know how the turn was managed. Probably in the double length each turned round his own post. There's some evidence that in the long distance they all used a central post. We can see on vases the different technique of the sprint and of the long distance. Though we must allow for artistic license, runners did not have the same foot and arm forward at once. Times weren't kept. Victory was what counted. On the fourth day came the wrestling, decided by 3 clear throws. The wrestlers were naked and their bodies slippery with olive oil. Then came boxing. The hands were bound with leather thongs and blows were directed to the head, not to the body. Next came the pancration, a combination of boxing and wrestling and pretty brutal. Tripping and kicking, dislocating of limbs and strangling were normal practice. Only biting and gouging out of eyes were illegal, as the contestants are doing here. On the right, the umpire's raising his rod. This day concluded with a race in armour, a popular and picturesque event. It must have been a welcome relief after the fighting events. So on the 5th day came the proclamation of the victors and a ceremonial procession to the temple of Zeus, where they were crowned with a garland of wild olive. And was this all they competed for? No, it wasn't. They were competing for the honor of their own city-state, as the various issues of coins show. There were no team competitions, but it's a mistake to overstate the individualism. The individual had his life only as a member of the polis, the city, and their cities recognized the fact. This inscription records a decree by the Athenian people that whosoever shall have won the athletic contests at Olympia or Delphi or the Isthmus or Nemea shall have free board at the town hall and likewise other honors separately. Pindar says that celebrating victors tells us more about their cities than about the men themselves, but he tells us something also of their pursuit of excellence and the desire for glory that drove them on.
Creatures of a day. Does man exist? Does he not? Man is a dream of a shadow. But when a gleam of light comes as a gift from God, then he enjoys bright glory, and life is sweet.